It seems Insomniac not only want to take the record for most games shipped within a 12-month period, but they also want to grab the same for improvement patches. I'm trying my hardest to keep up, fresh on the back of me covering the game in further detail over the weekend with my in-depth tech review, the second one. I'm back with a fast look at the latest update they just dropped today. It has a big list of improvements and enhancements which you can see on the screen, but one caught my eye, and it was something that happened when we had review code. The game made a system call query if you had a 120 FPS screen, and if so, it ran the game at 120 FPS, but it kept the refresh rate or frame rate the same, so 33 milliseconds or 16 milliseconds for 30 or 60 FPS respectively. They have gone one better here and continued on that return to the 90s feel the entire game has. From the shoot 'em up feel, Panzer Dragoon moment, better than cartridge loading, rail grinding, skateboarding, and now they've gone all European on us. Well, almost. Allow me to explain. As I discussed in my Xbox 120 FPS BC video, game engines are often designed to render the game and raster the image to the screen autonomous of each other. When they do this, this means that games can easily change modes to 30, 60 or even higher refresh rates. If the hardware can run or other elements can be changed, but hardware, well, modern hardware at least, is tied to update the image to the beat of the TV or the monitor's drum. So if a TV only supports 60 Hz or 60 FPS, this means that the game can only flip or replace the current image on screen with a new one at best every 16 milliseconds, which is the speed the TV will allow it. Now with games being locked into that regular drum beat, it means whenever they drop a frame or really miss their frame time budget to get the new image out to the TV in time, then they have to wait for the next refresh cycle. So missing by 1 millisecond means on a VSync title you miss by 16 milliseconds the next frame. And this is why I say miss by a millisecond, miss by a mile. But the problem with modern TVs and the standard level that HDMI brought in was that 60 Hz means you can only run games divisible by that number. And that is why we get 60 or 30 FPS. That's the next rate after 60, dividing it by 2. And then it drops to 20, divided by 3, and then divide by 4 gives you 15. And you keep adding 16 milliseconds to the time, and this gives you a fixed ratio of which you can run titles. And that's why when games drop below 30, they automatically drop to 20 when they're VSynced. It's one of the reasons why, adaptive VSync or VSync turned off gives you a better performance, because it removes this limitation. But by running the hardware at 120 Hz, if you have a sufficient TV, then that allows this limit to be halved, now enabling the engine to show a new frame every 8 milliseconds. Now this means not only does that 1 millisecond miss now only have half the cost of the frame rate, frame time, but with a faster refresh you are less likely to notice it and input times are faster for it. Twice as fast, possibly. Now this also means that that divide by issue we've just gone through means that you are nigh on 2 decades limited by this process. Now that we can go to 8 milliseconds, the next refresh, if we miss by 1 millisecond, we also have a much wider level of division. It now starts at 120 Hz or 120 FPS at the top, and as long as you stay in lockstep of 8.3 milliseconds, but if you drop below that, the next one, divided by 2, is 60 FPS, 16 milliseconds. But here is where the big gain is. Rather than being forced to halve that again, you can have that division of 120 FPS level by 3, which means 120 divided by 3 is 40 Hz or 40 FPS. So we're now adding that 8 millisecond window we have onto the 60 millisecond rate, giving us 25 milliseconds per frame, a 33% increase in the throughput of the engine and hardware over the old 30 FPS, or a 33% increase in the frame time over 60 FPS. Now 40 FPS seems weird to many of you, I know, but us oldies and certainly Europeans, as this was not an American thing at all back in the days of analog TVs and PAL, NTSC, CCAM, etc. But 60 Hz was not always a standard, and Never the Same Colour Twice US audiences always had 60 Hz on old consoles and obviously VHS tapes, just like the Japanese market. But in Germany, France, Spain, UK, etc., we all had PAL and SCART, but that's a discussion for another time. As this all ran at 50 Hz or 50 FPS, and by and large, it felt as smooth as 60. Obviously, aside the engine slowdown issues or that 16% reduction, but this is a topic for another time, and I've discussed this before in my old retro videos. The point is that by using different refresh rates, you gain a similar feel of 60 for a cheaper cost, and I think this new 120 FPS option could be a goldmine to bring us back to some of that older home micro and console heyday. Having that option in your engine means that games could run at that 33% increase over that 30 FPS, and it does feel different, it does feel smoother. Not as good as 60, but certainly better than 30. Now, it does look and feel smoother on screen. It helps reduce that blur and that ghosting that modern screens provide, and it becomes consistent in terms of its performance, that it feels better overall. It helps the game look and feel smoother. Now, as engines, many engines now are designed to run at arbitrary frame rates, this means that it is a much simpler option to just change the frame time, as this is all that matters for game engines. Frame rate is just the byproduct of frame time. So long as it's consistent, then it feels better, and this certainly does. But it also helps reduce input latency by the same potential, as the next screen display is that much faster and closer together. And this is exactly what we see here. You can see the 3 modes tested here with my input latency process, where I have the controller wired up to a light so I can capture it on a high-speed camera. But both 40 and 60 were done at that 120 FPS update rate on the screen, and the flat 30 is obviously at 60 because you can't run it at that way. And sure enough, we get a 33% improvement, give or take, over that version as the medium, which drops the median down from 100 milliseconds to just 67 milliseconds. And now that is only 30% something slower than the 60 FPS mode, and you can definitely feel it on the controller. It's close to half, or close enough that you can feel that difference in movement, and it just makes the game feel that little smoother. The screen, the ghosting reduction, the input times, and the overall performance is very welcome, and it's also pretty good. You do get some small skips in cinematics and leaping between worlds, but that was the same on other versions. But by and large, it runs close. Heavy combat can have a couple more dips than it did on the 30 FPS mode, but remember, the PS5 is now running that exact same dynamic 4K ray trace 30 FPS at maximum settings, 33% faster than before. And it holds up pretty well as the other modes. Incredible stuff again from Insomniac, and long may these wide choices and modes continue, because they're simple to use, but they really enhance the options if you have them on the console and the screen in your house. Now, only if we could get 240 FPS modes in these consoles and screens, we could get within touching distance of those hallowed 50Hz PAL days. I'll take 48, that'll do me. But until then, an even smoother and improved Ratchet and Clank is the result of what Insomniac have done yet again. Absolutely luscious. Anyway, if you want to check out much more on Ratchet and Clank, then go and check out my deep dive into the game, which I put up at the weekend. That will explain far more about why this game is so impressive, how great it looks, the ray tracing, and all the other great stuff in terms of those PBR materials, animation routines, and all that good stuff that is wrapped up in this title. But you've now got an even better mode to play that 30 FPS one that little bit smoother. I'll catch you on the next one.